Hello and welcome to another of the eBiology Teacher Podcast. I'm Mr. Doc, and today we continue talking about plants. We have started with an overview of plants, the different kind of plants you see and that sort of thing. What we're going to do today is talk specifically about roots and stems. Now I'm going to give you a little caveat, a little heads up here. We could spend just hours and hours and hours talking about different roots and different stems and da-da-da-da-da. What we're going to do is stick to the ones that are most common to us, specifically angiosperms. Those are flowering plants. So that's what we're going to concentrate most of our time and consideration on. We're going to look at monocots and dicots separately, okay, because there are some major differences. But we're not going to get into the major differences between the root systems of, say, gymnosperms or seedless vascular plant. We're just not going to go there. We still have time, and partly, and also we're talking about things that are really common. We're talking about the common plants that we generally interact with on a day-to-day basis. So let's take a look at the objectives and see what it is we want to learn. We're going to identify different types of cells found in plants. We're going to talk about their functions. We're going to identify the structures that make up a root system and how they function. We're going to talk about different types of root systems and why they have certain advantages and disadvantages. And then we're going to talk about the structures that make up a stem and how stems function. So, we've got a lot to do today, so let's go ahead and get started with plant cells. Just like humans and other animals, plants have different kinds of cells because they have different functions. Our skin cells are different than our muscle cells are different than our liver cells are different than our nerve cells. Plants have different things, different parts, and those different parts do different things. And if you learned anything from watching this lecture series, hopefully you certainly know that form determines function, okay, or shape determines function. So for a plant to have different structures, they're going to have cells that are made up differently to do that particular function. Three major types of cells in a plant are the parenchyma cells, which are loosely packed, cubed shaped cells that generally store and conduct water, that store water and conduct photosynthesis, which means parenchyma cells generally have a high number of chloroplasts because they do photosynthesis. They're very commonly the primary cell in the fleshy or leafy parts of plants. So most of the leafy structure of a plant is made up of parenchyma cells. Collenchyma cells have thicker walls. They tend to be irregularly shaped, and they do provide support for plants. That's a good idea since plants don't have bones. Cells are going to have to do that. Cells are going to have to take control. So collenchyma cells are helpful in that. And so are sclerenchyma cells. Sclerenchyma cells generally are thicker walled, they are tightly packed, and they make up the slightly harder parts of a plant. Now, sclerenchyma cells, for example, if you've ever been in like elementary school and you took a leaf and you put a piece of paper over it and you scratched it with your like crayon or chalk, you got those little lines or the veins of the leaf. Those are stiff vascular structures. The vascular structures are made of those hard sclerenchyma cells because, again, plants don't have bones. So the vascular structures not only have to be able to conduct water like xylem does and conduct food, water, and minerals like phloem does, but they also have to be able to support themselves and thus support the plant. Okay, so that means that most of the vascular tissue, which we're getting ready to talk about, is made from sclerenchyma cells. Vascular tissue is responsible, as I've said, for moving materials from one part to a plant to the other, and it's found in roots, stems, and leaves. That shouldn't surprise you. We have blood vessels all over our body, from the tips of our fingers and the tips of our toes to our face, our nose, everywhere. The vascular tissue in us provides the cells the stuff it needs, oxygen and food. Well, the veins in a plant provides the plant with what they need. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, gets rid of oxygen actually. Glucose, water, all of those things are going to be in that vascular tissue and all the parts of the plant that's needed. So it shouldn't surprise you that they're found in roots, stems, leaves, and pretty much everywhere else. It also shouldn't surprise you that they're made up primarily of sclerenchyma cells. Now, if you look at the diagram, we see here this large tube is conducting water in one direction. That's xylem. We've talked about that in a previous lecture. This other tube is going in both directions. It's got it's got dissolved particles in it. So the blue little dots are water and the red dots are carbohydrates. And this is phloem, and you'll notice that phloem goes in multiple directions. One thing that does happen is here it's marked the source. So let's say that this is a leaf, for example. It's doing photosynthesis, it makes carbohydrates. It deposits those carbohydrates into the phloem, and the phloem can take the carbohydrates down into something like a sink where carbohydrates are going to be stored. And that could be somewhere in the roots or somewhere in a different part of the plant. So that's how these vascular tissues work. Let's talk about roots. Let's get back to our roots. Stop it. All right. Roots really have two jobs. One is to anchor the plant in one place, and the other is to absorb nutrients and water from the soil and allow them to grow. You can't separate these two, and neither one is more or less important than the other. A plant has to be rooted down because a plant wants to grow where they know it can get the nutrients it needs. So a plant does no good if it's surrounded by nutrients but doesn't have a way to hold on and stay there. And on the other side of that, a plant won't hold on and stay somewhere if there are no nutrients there for it. Of course, it doesn't have the luxury to get up and go to a different restaurant, so it's in a bit of trouble. So plants root where they know that they can find the things that they need, and they try to stay there as long as they can. And if nutrients run out, well, sometimes that's all she wrote, right? Now, there are different types of root systems that we can look at. First is the taproot system. Another is a fibrous root system. And the third, and probably what I consider to be the most interesting, is the adventitious root system. A taproot system consists of a single large or primary root that has smaller offshoot roots that grow from it. The root is generally, obviously, under the ground. Carrots and radishes are good examples of these, by the way. And what we see in the diagram of the radish, we have this large single taproot and these little bitty roots that sort of shoot off of it. That's characteristic of a taproot system. One big advantage to this is that all of the roots sort of have a single place to call home. They're sort of the central location. It's a very simple root system, and the nice part is that single taproot also can serve as a storage tank for things that the plant needs, kind of like in a carrot. Now, a fibrous root system consists of hundreds of small roots that grow in many, many different directions. Grasses are a good example, and most monocots, for example, are fibrous root systems. Let's think about this for a second. Fibrous roots have roots going in every which direction, which means they probably have the ability to kind of search out nutrients a little bit better than taproots. They also have the ability to spread out. Okay, so in a taproot system, we have one large single root. In a fibrous root system, if some of the side roots are damaged, the other roots can be fine. They'll be okay. So in that case, that's an advantage to a fibrous root system in that there's not a single root to damage, because if the single taproot is damaged or destroyed, the whole plant is done. The third and final root system we're going to talk about is called an adventitious root system, and they are specialized roots that grow out from the stem, or in some cases even the leaves, to hold the plant in place. Now, if you look at this one right here, what we see here is a tropical style plant in which the roots are actually coming out of the stem above ground and then going underground. This is really common to see in tropical areas. Part of the reason for that is that in tropical areas that are really wet, the soil profile can change, meaning that soil can erode. It's also incredibly competitive. I mean, you're talking about these tropical areas. Plants want to live there as much as we do. So what happens is they have to kind of adventure out to find a place to really root in. Another thing is they sometimes need to be above ground to get carbon dioxide into the roots. So what happens is the roots have to start out above ground and then go underground. Mangrove swamps, for example, in the southeastern part of the United States, Most of those are adventitious style root systems. Another one that's more common, maybe more toward the central part or the northern part of the United States, is of course is ivy. Ivy has special roots that anchor to walls and have the ability to climb. Now, not all climbing plants have adventitious root systems. There are some plants that form specialized leaf structures called tendrils. But a lot of those plants that have the ability to climb and hold on tight are in fact adventitious root systems. And they can feed on water that flows down a wall. So as it rains, water flows out of that wall. And then the ivy's roots absorb the water that's flowing down, pulls it into the plant. Bob's your uncle. Now let's take a look at the microscopic structure of a root. We have here vascular tissue, which we've talked about over and over again and will continue to do so. These large pinkish-like bubbles in the dicot are xylem, and these little clusters here, 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 and here are phloem. Now, in between those are tissue called pericycle, and the pericycle is sort of filler that kind of fills that space up in between the xylem and the phloem. In the monocot root, we still have those large xylem tubes and those baby blue colored phloem tubes, and then of course the pericycle is that filler tissue. Both of these have a nice little layer that goes around the vascular tissue called the endodermis. And then on the outside of the endodermis is a thick layer of tissue called the cortex that makes up the rest of the root. Then you have the outer layer, which is actually called the epidermis. And if you look over here at this picture, we take a look at a plant that has germinated, and we see this root, and we see these tiny little what look like hairs on them. Those are in fact root hairs. Root hairs are incredibly important because of two things. Think back to our small intestine. They've got all those little villi fingers, right, that we talked about in previous lectures. That increases the surface area. The whole point of the small intestine is to absorb nutrients. Well, in a plant, the whole point of a root is to absorb nutrients. And the more surface area, the more nutrients you can absorb. So root hairs are kind of like the villi in the small intestine. They increase surface area, which allows to absorb nutrients more. But they also have another advantage. Remember, there are two jobs to a root: anchor and absorb nutrients. Well, root hairs help us absorb nutrients better, but they also help us anchor in place better. Because instead of having 5 fingers, root hairs give us thousands and thousands of fingers that help us hold on and don't let go, right? That's why it's so hard to pull a plant out of the ground, because of those little root hairs. Even though one of them would break very, very easily, when there are thousands and thousands of them, that strength combines, and they are greater than the whole, so to speak. Now, let's take a look at a bigger model and in a different view than what we're looking at. Whoa! That's a big root. What? Okay, now I'm going to zoom in. That's a huge model of a root that is longitudinally sectioned. And I'm going to show you the different parts. All right? Go to my second camera. All right? Now, if we look at this, this is a longitudinal section of a root. So that means the root is going down on the ground like that. This center section here, these large tube-like structures, are called xylem. This light greenish stuff here is going to be our phloem, and this pinkish light colored white stuff is the pericycle. Then we have the endodermis. That's the layer that's going to protect the vascular bundle, and here we have the cortex, all this yellow stuff. Then this dark brown layer is the epidermis, and if you look right here, that's the beginning of a root hair. Now, xylem, pericycle, phloem, endodermis, cortex, and then the epidermis on the outside. This right here, this area here, is a hotbed for the plant to grow and develop and reproduce cells. As a matter of fact, if you look here at a plant's root, you would see a lot of cells at this area, this general area, really starting to grow and develop. In case you're wondering, this model also gives you a good idea from a cross-section standpoint. Again, we have the vascular tissue, the cortex, and the epidermis. All right? So, that is our model. Whew. Got to get the work done. Yeah, we'll come back to that in a minute. All right, so if there aren't any questions about roots, and since there aren't, because this is a video and you can't ask me questions, so sorry, let's move on to talk about stems. Stems provide the upward support of all the materials for a plant that are above ground, including the flowers and the leaves and the fruits and vegetables that grow on a plant. Now, a stem consists of several outward parts. The point on a stem in which leaves grow is called a node. And the space between leaves or between nodes is called the internode. So there's a node here, and there's a node here, and this is the internode. All right? Lateral buds are points on a plant, and you see one here, in which there will be a new shoot to grow, or a new branch off the original stem. Lateral buds allow for the growth of new branches off the stem. The terminal bud, the one here at the end, will allow the stem to elongate, to continue to grow that way. Now, once again, the buds, terminal and lateral, are where we'd really expect to see a lot of cellular division, because that's the point at which the cell starts to, or the plant starts to grow and divide and make more cells. So, we have the nodes where each of the leaves are coming off. We have the stem proper. We have the inner nodes, which is the space between nodes. We have the lateral buds where the offshoots or the branches will branch off. And we have the terminal bud where the stem will continue to elongate or grow. Now, if we look at monocot stems on the microscopic level, we start to see a different ballgame. And I'm going to tell you now, this starts to get confusing if you don't differentiate between this is a root and this is a stem. Things start to get a little confusing, okay? A little cross-eyed, right? So pay attention here and focus, all right? In the monocot stem, what we will see are vascular bundles that are randomly dispersed and scattered throughout the whole stem, okay? Then we have this ground tissue that sort of is the filler between all the vascular bundles. We have the epidermis on the outside, and that is our monocot stem. If I were to look at a stem under the microscope and I saw all of these vascular bundles that are just scattered to the winds, I'm going to expect that that is a monocot, because that's a telltale sign. The dicot, however, has vascular bundles in a ring right around the edge. Okay? Now the ring around the edge is the vascular bundle area, and that's gonna come to a point here, because in a couple of minutes we're going to look at woody stems, and we're going to see why that outer ring of vascular bundles is going to be very important. On the inside here, this tissue that's all kind of bundled in the inside is called the pith. Okay, and this layer of tissue in between the vascular bundles and the epidermis is called the cortex. Okay, the cortex is at the place where the vascular bundles and the epidermis are dividing. And of course, the cortex in this situation has the ability to really grow, so we would see a good bit of cellular division there as well. Now, there is something to consider here, and that is how stems grow. Some stems, like in annuals, will grow, they will hopefully flower, produce seeds, and then they will die out. And the plant is done, and hopefully the seeds that plant produced will carry on and make new plants. Perennials, on the other hand, will grow stems. The stems will die off, but the root structure and the core part of the plant will stay safe and basically hibernate underground. Some stems, however, will not die. They will harden, and then the next season they will continue to grow from where they left off, giving us what's called secondary growth. Herbaceous or green stems, and by the way, I use the word green not as in color, but green as in young. It's kind of a synonym. Herbaceous stems are usually soft and represent only one season's growth, whereas woody stems consist of hardened woody tissue that moves, that starts in the outside of the plant and forms new wood on the inside. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you now that comment is a little confusing because we are going to have an area of tissue in woody stems on the outside, and tissue will grow from that ring. Well, it actually grows in both directions, but primarily we start on the outside and grow our way in, giving us outer layers. Okay, so the outer layer of a woody stem is actually the youngest layer of a woody stem. Okay, now woody stems can consist of several layers, and they can help us determine the age of the plant. This is somewhat of an old wives' tale. You've often heard that you can tell the age of a tree by counting its rings. That's both true and misleading, okay? Because you have to know what it is you're counting, and you have to know what a ring really is. Well, a ring's a circle. Not so fast. Let's clear that up real quick, okay? Woody stems grow by season, and each season gives us a distinctly different ring. Spring wood contains lots of xylem because in the spring, traditionally there's more water. So that means as the tree grows, we're going to develop more vascular tissue that will conduct water because water is simply available. In the summertime, however, less water is available, which means we're going to produce less xylem. Now, this is important because remember, xylem were these big open tubes, right? Well, that means that spring wood, which has a lot of xylem, is going to be sort of open and light in color because of the huge openings that the xylem have. The summer wood is going to have less xylem, which means it's going to have more phloem, and that means it's going to be smaller tubes, which is going to give it a darker appearance. So if we look at this picture, you can see here that the spring wood is this grayish lighter color wood, and the darker brown wood is the summer wood. Spring wood, again, having more xylem and represents the growth of the tree during the spring season, and then the darker wood being the growth during the summer. A single annual ring, which represents 1 year's growth, is both a spring and a summer wood ring. That's because 1 year's growth would include one spring season and one summer season's growth, one of each, right? Well, Mr. Doc, why isn't there a fall and winter ring? Well, simple. In the fall, trees don't grow because they've lost their leaves. Therefore, they're not producing glucose to help them grow. And of course, in the winter, they still don't have leaves, so why would they grow? Trees are basically hibernating or taking a winter vacation starting in the fall once they lose their leaves. We're not going to see any growth there. Growth is going to start back up in the spring once the leaves start to grow, provide the tree more going to provide the tree more energy, and the energy can grow from there. So you're not going to see winter and fall growth rings. They just don't happen. But you will see spring and summer, and one spring and summer together, side by side, is 1 year's growth. So you can't go light ring, dark ring, light ring, dark ring. It's one light and one dark. One light and one dark equals 1 year. All right, and then of course we do have parts of the wood. We have the heartwood, which is the center part inside the woody stem. We have what's called sapwood, which is this area right outside the heartwood, and then we have the bark. Now I think it's going to be helpful to take a look at an actual tree trunk, and luckily enough, we've got one right there. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring this big boy over. No, God. And let's take a look at what it is that we are seeing. All right? Ooh. Let's zoom in. Oh, there's nothing more exciting than looking at plants, right? All right. If we see here, you can see that we have alternating sort of colors in our spring wood, summer wood alternation. This lighter colored ring here represents spring wood. The darker color ring is going to represent summer wood. So these two combined equal 1 year's growth. So if we were counting, this would be 1 year, that would be 1 year, that would be 1 year, that would be 1 year. The other thing that we can use this for is to tell us the conditions in that year. For example, if we look, first of all, early in the tree's life, you'll notice that the rings are really, really large because initially the tree's going to grow very aggressively. But once we get to here, Notice how thin, I don't know if you can see that where you're standing, there's a tiny, tiny, tiny little springwood and an even smaller summerwood. Well, that tells us something happened that year to prevent this tree from growing very much. Probably we had not enough water, okay? Or perhaps a particularly cold year in which the plant didn't grow very much. We can also see up here where we have huge spring wood and a little bit of summer wood, a lot of spring wood and some summer wood. That probably is a pretty healthy year. But once we get here, you notice this really fine line of summer wood. That means that we probably had a particularly harsh summer that year. You probably didn't see me doing all that. But if we had a very thin summer wood line, then chances are we had a pretty dry summer. All right, so that's how we can look at those and really see what it is that they mean. So let's go back to our objectives and see what we've learned. The different types of cells found in a plant include parenchyma cells, which are loosely packed. They contain chloroplasts. They're part of the fleshy parts of the plant, usually the leaf-like structures. We have parenchyma cells, which are thicker, irregularly walled cells that provide support, and sclerenchyma cells that make up the harder portions of a plant, particularly the vascular tissue, which is very important because the vascular tissue provides all the parts of the plant the stuff that it needs. The different structures that make up the root of a plant include the vascular tissue and the pericycle that supports it. We have an endodermis, which creates a huge vascular bundle in the center of the plant. We have the cortex around that and the epidermis around that. And of course, roots often have root hairs, which increase their surface area, which increases their ability to uptake nutrients, and it increases their ability to hold on to the soil. Different types of root systems include the taproot system, which consists of a large single root and smaller subroots off the single root. You have fibrous systems that have hundreds of different little roots that go in every which direction from the bottom of the plant. And you have adventitious root systems that branch off from either the leaves or the stem in order to hold the plant in place and allow the plant to be more competitive and reach for resources that may have been out of its range from a traditional style root system. And finally, the structures of a plant stem include its nodes, which is where leaves grow, its internodes, which are the spaces between leaves, the lateral buds, which is where a new leaf will grow outward to form a branch, or where it will branch off, and the terminal bud, which allows the stem to grow longer. Inside the stems, you have vascular bundles that consist of xylem and phloem. In monocots, you have ground tissue between all the different vascular bundles, which are sort of dispersed all over the place. In dicots, you have a ring of vascular bundles around the outside and all that pith in the middle. You have a layer of cortex around the outside, which will allow the root, or the stem, to grow. And then you have the outer epidermis. And of course, if you think about stems in terms of secondary growth occurs by season. In spring wood, you have light dense wood that has a lot of xylem called spring wood, and in the summer you have less xylem, so it's more dense. We call that summer wood, and one annual ring is 1 year's worth of spring wood and 1 year's worth of summer wood, and you can count those to get the relative age of a tree. The tree does consist of heartwood in the center, sapwood, and then bark. I am going to go back to this for 1 second because I think there's one thing that we probably ought to talk about. A lot of people have misconceptions about how trees grow. All right, and to do that, I'm going to take a look back at our big old trunk. Okay, so let's zoom out of the trunk here. What I want you to take a look at is this area right here. And we did kind of leave this off in our lecture. Trees do not grow from the center out. Imagine how difficult that would be. Because then what would have to happen is the tree would have to grow and sort of fill in the gaps. Grow out, fill in all the gaps. That's not going to happen. What happens is the tree grows from this ring of tissue right here called the vascular cambium. What it does is produces xylem on the inside and more phloem on the outside to produce this bark. As the tree gets bigger and bigger, the bark splits, and that's why that bark has that rough texture, because this is growing inside uniformly, and it's not keeping up on the outside, so the outside is starting to crack to make those little bumps. This vascular cambium is really what allows a tree trunk to get girthier or wider in nature. That occurs right here, okay? So the vascular cambium is really the part of the tree that provides the widening of the tree itself, not the center. If you think about it, that really makes physical sense. A tree trying to grow from the center out, pushing everything out, that's not going to happen, all right? I hope this has helped you understand how roots and stems work and how important they are. They're incredibly complex. So the next time you run into a plant, please apologize, because you shouldn't run into plants. And second of all, recognize that they're just as complex as we are. They've got the kind of things going on that we've got going on. They depend on things just like we depend on them, and they provide services just like we provide services. So you know what? Thank a plant today. Shake their stem and say, "Plant, I appreciate what you do for me." Have a great day, and I'll see you next time right here on MrDocsOnlineLab.com and our podcasts. Bye.